So up next we have the understated rock star of the industry, JP, who is going to be speaking to us about Privacy Pioneers, a blueprint for security professionals to kickstart a privacy program. Now I'm going to spin through JP's bio and then I'm going to add a couple of words. JP is at Acumenis as a lead security consultant. He actively supports organisations in identifying security risks and implementing controls and frameworks to enhance their security posture. This includes assisting organisations to implement and test incident management procedures, as well as working with them in responding in real events. JP's experience includes working as an information security manager at an Australian bank. During this time, JP achieved notable milestones such as establishing information security team, security operations centre. JP's professional qualifications include certifications in cyber operations, ethical hacking, incident response and vulnerability management. JP actively engages with the information security community, contributing through organising local SecTalks, chapter meetings, participating as a speaker at conferences, events and podcasts, and as a mentor in the Australian Women in Security, AUSCERT mentoring program. JP gives so much back to the industry and has so much to say, and I've learned a hell of a lot from this chap, so please join me in welcoming him to stage.
Excellent. Thanks for the kind words. It's humbling to be thought of so highly by someone who themselves has done so much for InfoSec, so thank you. I'm a bit nervous. Mizuno did a really good talk, and I think I might ask next time to make sure I don't have to follow him. No dragons in my talk today, I am sorry, but hopefully we'll still have some useful bits and pieces for everybody. So I think you guys have got a bit of a rundown on who I am, but it's there on the slide in case you need to know. If you want to reach out and say good day and let me know how you're going with implementing privacy in your organisation, you can scan the QR code or take you to LinkedIn and we can go from there. So implementing a privacy program is pretty easy. There's a few key steps you need to do. The first one is you need to make sure that your website is in a really hard to find spot, your privacy policy, hard to find spot on your website. You need one of those really annoying cookie banners. The more annoying it is, the better you've implemented privacy within your organisation. And of course, don't forget to update your canned response from we take security seriously to we take security and privacy seriously. So thanks for coming along to my talk. If there's any questions, I'll take those now. Cookie banners. Right, what we're really going to talk about today, we're going to talk about some of the privacy concepts, just so if there's anyone in the room that hasn't really dove into privacy before, but is looking at it, we're all kind of on the same page. Then we're going to start talking about some of the legislation and frameworks you might come across, and then we'll get into probably what you're here for, and that's the steps on how to get started and those things that you can take away and get going in your organisation. So a couple of definitions to get out of the way first. So the first one is around the individual. So the individual is also called the data principal or the data subject or all number of other things, but we're talking about the person who has the data that you are collecting. They're the ones that are concerned with what you do with it and whether it's up to date from their perspective as well. And they're kind of the central focus of privacy legislation and regulations and privacy frameworks as well. When we're talking about PII, this is something else. It gets called all sorts of different things. So PII, personal identifiable information. It also gets called things like personal data or personal information, all sorts of things. This is the type of data we're talking about, so things like your name, your address, your date of birth, your tax file number, a whole bunch of stuff. And it just means that it's about you, and it includes your opinions if they can be tied to your name. So an opinion about something by itself isn't too bad, but it's when it's correlated with all that other data, that's when it becomes personal information. Now, in the Australian Privacy Act, the entity is the name that they call it. The entity which controls your data. They don't differentiate between the next two things, which is a controller and a processor, but many of the frameworks and other regulations in other jurisdictions have this differentiation. So a controller, so that's the entity that decides what data is collected from the individual and decides why they're collecting it and what they're going to use it for. They're the ones that are primarily responsible for looking after the data, and they may look after that data themselves, they may process that data themselves, or they may give it to somebody else. Which brings us to the processor. So the processor doesn't get to decide what data is collected, they don't get to decide why it's collected, they just get the data, and they do something with the data, and then maybe they give it back to the controller. They don't own it, and they don't, like I said, they don't decide why it's collected. They can do all sorts of things, so we're talking about analysing or storing or managing, a whole bunch of things that they could do with it. You can tell I've implemented privacy well because I've got lots of annoying cookie banners. So as an example of the difference between a controller and a processor and an individual and how they interact, as a bit of a story. Now, as Glenn said, I used to work at a bank, so here's a banking story. So I'm an individual, I want to open a bank account, so the bank has to collect some information about me. Some of that information they have to collect by law, and some of it they collect because they're interested, and some of it they collect because of the types of things that I do with them. So they decide what to collect, even though some of that they have to, they still decide to collect it. They decide what to do with it and why they're collecting it. So that way they're the controller. Now as part of that service they give me, so I've got my account and I go shopping and then they send me a statement. Let's pretend like it's 1990 and we're still getting paper statements. What they will do is they'll outsource that function a lot of the time to a provider, a mailing house, that sends me my statement. So they send some information to the mailing house, they print it on a piece of paper, put it in an envelope, and put it in the post to me. So the mailing house is a processor. They don't get to decide what information they collect about me. The bank gives them the information based on that contract that they have. They don't get to decide why they do that. I mean, obviously they're trying to make some money, but they don't get to do anything else with that information. So they are the processor. They're doing the processing of that personal information on behalf of the bank. Now let's think about another example with the same bank. So maybe I want a prepaid gift card and I go and talk to a gift card company, and the gift card company will need to collect some information about me. It may be different information that they're collecting than the bank would collect for my account, so they get to decide what type of information they collect when I buy the gift card. So they become the controller. They decide what information, why they're collecting it. But the prepaid card company, they're a little bit smaller than the bank, so they have an agreement with the bank to process transactions because they don't want to worry about all that infrastructure and having to look after all of that stuff. They just want to sell these cards. So the bank then also becomes a processor, and it processes the information that the gift card company or the prepaid card company sends to the bank. They don't get to decide. If I'm not a customer of theirs, they don't get to decide to collect any other information or anything like that. It's the card company that do that. So with those both examples, the bank is both a controller and a processor at the same time. So in your organisations, we'll talk about this in a little bit, as you go through, for some things, you may be a controller, for some things, you may be a processor, or you may be a little bit of both for some of those business activities. Fun times, privacy regulations. Who's excited about privacy regulations? I'm sure that's why you all came here today. So there's one main one that we'll talk about, and I picked on this one because last time I checked, we're in Australia on the sunny Gold Coast. So the Australian Privacy Act is pretty relevant for most of us, and we'll touch on a couple of the others as well. There's a few things that the Australian Privacy Act has brought to us, and one of those is the notifiable data breach scheme. Now, I'm sure most of us have heard of this. I'd be surprised if not. But they outline what a notifiable data breach is, and reporting obligations around that if you're an entity that meets the criteria. They also give us some examples in the OAIC website of what a notifiable data breach could be. Now, we all know about super hack ransomwares, Medibank, MediSecure, all these things. Yes, they're notifiable data breaches, but they also include some fairly simple day-to-day mundane things that happen in most organisations. So it's things like somebody losing their laptop and mobile phone, somebody misaddressing an email and sending a spreadsheet of personal information to the wrong person, those types of things. So when we're talking about data breaches, yes, we include all the big Medibanks and things like that, but it's also these smaller day-to-day things as well. And the most common data breach notification reporting type are these smaller misaddressed emails and things like that, accidental data leakage events. The Australian privacy principles have also been given to us as well as part of the Privacy Act, and we'll kind of run through them. They're split into about 5 different categories. So the first one's around the consideration of personal information. And what we're looking at here, the first privacy principle is around the open and transparent management of personal information. So personal information is the term that PII gets in the Act. So it means you have to comply with the principles, you have to be able to deal with inquiries and complaints and those types of things. The next one is anonymity and pseudonymity. And what that means is you can give people the option of not identifying themselves when they're dealing with you. So, if you're doing a withdrawal from a bank, definitely you hope that they're going to identify anyone that's pretending to be you before they hand over your cash. But if you're going to buy a t-shirt, maybe you don't need to identify yourself in order to buy a t-shirt. You should be able to do that without being identified. The next set deal with the collection of personal information. So the collection of solicited personal information. So this is the information the entity is asking about you and from you. And there's certain rules around this. Ideally, you're gathering that from the person themselves that you're collecting the information from. And if it's sensitive personal information, which is a different category of information, it includes things like your opinion or your religion and things like that, then they have to get consent. Unsolicited information. So this is information that you might give in an organisation without them really asking for it. So maybe you call their contact centre and you start telling them a whole heap of stuff about your life because you're a bit stressed out about the service not working or something like that. And you give them all this information that they haven't asked for, and for whatever reason, that might be sensitive information. So as an organisation, they have a responsibility to delete that information or de-identify it if it's not required. They can keep it if it's the type of information that they can collect under the solicited information principle, but if not, then it has to be deleted. Notification of the collection of personal information is number 5. So here is where you're having to notify someone that you're collecting their personal information so that they're aware of what's happening, and you also need to be able to provide them some contact details so that you can meet some of the other principles that we'll talk about in a second. There's special rules around how you use personal information. So if you collect it for one thing and you've told the person, hey, I'm collecting your information for this thing, you can't use it for something else. There are some special rules around direct marketing, which is number 7. So if the organisation has your personal information, this one I thought was kind of interesting, they can't use it for direct marketing unless it's reasonably expected that they would. So I guess that means when I open my bank account, I kind of expect the bank's going to direct market me with my email address and my phone number. But they have to be able to provide an easy opt-out. And they have to check that I haven't opted out before they contact me for direct marketing. Outside of that, if I've consented to that direct marketing, then it's all good and they can send me that through. Number 8 has to do with cross-border disclosure. So what this means is if you're sending personal information outside of Australia, there's certain rules around how you can do that. So what you have to do is you've got to make sure that the place you're sending it to has similar rules around privacy that Australia does, and that the person whose information you're sharing would be able to take legal action if they didn't look after it properly in that country. So they're the main ones there. There are some cross-border agreements, which is interesting to check on, because some of those countries, so there's one for APAC, it means that you can share information with other APAC countries that are part of the agreement, and it makes it a bit easier, you don't have to do so many checks. Number 9, we're getting through them. So number 9 is around the use of government identifiers. So let's say you're a fancy new startup and you're doing some work with tax information, and you decide that you're going to use people's tax file numbers as the primary key in your database. So principle number 9 says that's not a good idea and you're not allowed to do that. These cookie banners. Okay, number 10 is around the quality of personal information, and it's making sure it's up to date, that you are giving people the opportunity to update that as well, and I've jumped ahead. Yeah, so making sure it's correct and up to date. Number 11 is where it finally starts getting into the information security thing a little bit more, and it's making sure that your personal information is protected. So this is all the things that we're used to doing with all sorts of different information. So making sure it's protected, you know, firewalls, MFA, all that kind of good stuff. Number 12 is giving people access to the information. So if somebody asks, you need to be able to reasonably quickly and free of charge provide them with a copy of the information you hold about them, and also you need to be able to give them the opportunity to update that and correct anything that's incorrect. Whew, I said it was going to be exciting. There are other privacy regulations that impact some organisations that operate in Australia. So the GDPR is one, which thanks to Brexit, we have a UK version as well as an EU version. We also have a multitude of privacy laws in the US. So pretty much every state has their own. Some of them are more stringent than others. For example, I've forgotten the state, but they've just brought out privacy legislation which enables people to sue an organisation, not because they've had a breach, but just because they're not looking after it the way that they think they should. So a few little interesting things there. But generally speaking, it's like a big bowl of spaghetti with stuff everywhere, and it's hard to work out from state to state. Every now and then there's like a rumour that they're going to come out with some national standard or a piece of legislation, and then it never quite happens, but they're going through the stage of doing that again, so who knows. So how do we start managing all these privacy things, whether it's GDPR, the Australian privacy principles, or the spaghetti of the US system? Frameworks are a really good way of doing that, and as security people, we probably know a few frameworks, things like ISO 27001 and NIST cybersecurity framework. Those types of things are fairly familiar to us, and thankfully they also have privacy frameworks. So there's a NIST privacy framework, and you know, it kind of looks the same as the security one. You know, it's familiar, we're familiar with that, and we just add some of those security functions onto the bottom of it to give us that full set. With ISO 27001, the 27001 standard, there's also a 27701, too many numbers, and that sits on top of your 27001, so it extends it. So you have to have the 27001 if you're going to implement 27701, and it gives you some guidance on how to extend the existing 27001 controls, management clauses, those kind of things, as well as providing Annex A controls and Annex B controls of its own. So a separate set of controls whether you're a processor or a controller. So why would we be super concerned about privacy? When we went through the privacy principles, we saw not all of them are really tied into security things, but I think we have that familiarity with the standards like NIST, CSF, and ISO 27001 that we can build on top of. But also, a lot of the time when privacy is talked about in the news, it's also talked about from a cyber perspective as well. So you can see here that the National Cyber Security Coordinator, talking about Privacy Week, urging Australians to step up, and then a few days later, talking about the Minute Secure incident that has leaked personal information of, I'm guessing, a fair number of Australians based on the response. So there's a bit of an overlap. We're sort of in the middle of that Venn diagram. So if you're in an organisation that maybe doesn't have a separate privacy team, it's kind of easier for us to move into that privacy circle a little bit more and help the organisation out with some of those things, have a look at some of those frameworks, and go from there. So how do we get ready to implement the framework? So this is what I need to do part. We've done the legislation part. So the first one is about identifying what you need to know about privacy. So identifying your legal or regulatory requirements. It's about finding out what private information you already have and where it is. So have a look. I'm sure everybody has an asset register with all their information assets on, right? And maybe you've categorized them somehow. If you can, you go through and you add a privacy tag. So you say, okay, that system or that asset has personal information in it. You give it a little mark. Then you can go through and work out for each of those systems what exactly is collected. So is it somebody's name? Is it somebody's address? Or is it their name, address, date of birth, email address, phone number, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then once you know what exactly is collected, you can then work out why it's collected. And that then leads to, well, what are we using it for? Are we using it for the same reasons that we've collected it for? And so on. So when you are collecting it, 100% you have to use the data for what's collected unless you get consent and some of those other things. And it must also be related to one of your business activities. So let's say as a bank you decided to collect everybody's religion. It's not really related to the bank account. It doesn't matter what religion you are, the bank account's still going to do the same. So it's probably not really related to one of your business functions, so you probably shouldn't be collecting it. There may be some legal and regulatory requirements that you have to collect certain information. So depending on your industry, you'll have to collect different bits and pieces of information about people. And like we talked about before, depending on the jurisdiction, you may need to collect consent. So some of the other privacy regulations are more strict about direct marketing than the Australian privacy principles. So you need to just make sure you're across that when you're ready. Once you've worked out what information you have, why you're collecting it, and how you're using it, you can then work out where it's going to and where it's coming from. So part of your organisation may process personal information, so they're a processor, they're getting information from somewhere. You might be a collector, so you're collecting it from an individual, whether that's through an application, a paper-based form, a telephone call, and then where is that information going? Are you keeping it within your local data centre? Are you sending it overseas somewhere? And that can help you map out those high-level data flows. And then you can start looking at, well, am I transferring personal information cross-border? Do I need to worry about those cross-border protections and things like that? And then also it helps you work out whether you're a controller or a processor, So if you're using something like ISO 27701, that's an important distinction because those different annex controls will apply based on your outcome there. If you're just focused on the privacy principles, it's not so much of an important item. So far, we've started to get ourselves ready. We've done a little bit of research. We've identified what PII we have, why it's collected, and why we think we're allowed to keep it, where it's going, and we know whether we're a controller, a processor, or both. So now we are getting set to go and start having a bit more of a look at our risk around privacy. So hopefully everybody does risk assessments and treatment plans for their information security risks. Privacy risks are no different. So if you already have a risk register, just add to that is the easiest thing. So you don't need to have a separate risk register for privacy or security or for human resources or whatever. You can mush them all together if that suits your organization. If it suits you better to have them separately, then you can do that too. So have a look through your current risks and see if there's anything in there that would benefit from being expanded due to the new knowledge you have about your private information that your organization holds. Then you can go through and consider if there's any new risks. And once you've done this, a really good thing is to go back to your framework and have a look through the framework and see if it gives you any ideas on things you may have missed. And that can also feed into your treatment plans as well. So once you've identified your risks, whether it's an extended existing risk or a brand new privacy risk, you have a look at those risks and see if there's any controls in your privacy framework that would treat those risks. It might be a security risk that some of those privacy controls will help, and vice versa. Once you map it back to your privacy framework, have a look if there's any controls there that aren't tied to a risk, and have a think. Is that control treating a risk that I've overlooked? If it is, go back and pop it in your risk register. If not, then it's not really applicable, and off you go. So maybe cross-data transfer. You don't send information outside of your little local data center, so you don't need to worry about that one, for example. All right, so now we've done all of those things, and we've also done our risk assessment and our risk treatment. We're ready to go and start implementing some of our controls. So normally where we'd start is looking at your policies and processes. So like the risk register, you can have a whole separate set of privacy policies, separate set of security policies, or if it's easier for you, you can kind of merge them together. Because we're extending a security framework, it's quite easy to add those privacy controls into your security policies and procedures. Don't forget to add privacy on the agenda for any of your management meetings. So, if you have a cyber review board or a risk committee or something like that, make sure that privacy is on the agenda there. So then those privacy risks can be discussed and talked about as well. So some of the controls that we think about when we're thinking about securing private information are things like privacy by design. So making sure that if you're developing applications or implementing new projects or initiatives, those privacy things are built in at the start of the project. As security people, we've been talking about shifting left for, quite a while now, and it's maybe getting there. And it's the same reasons that we want to do that with privacy too. The sooner you identify issues, the easier it is to fix, and then it doesn't cost so much at the end of the day when you have to go back and implement things after you've launched in production. So things to think about are, if you're building an application, making the application easy for an individual to jump into and update their personal information, to check that it's correct. So that aligns with the privacy principle around providing individuals access to their personal information. You do it through the app. You don't have to have somebody on a phone or answering emails or anything like that. It's just all native within your application. Data minimization is a really big thing to think about, and this is probably one of the best things if you can, to minimize the amount of data that you hold will reduce your privacy risk 100 times, I'm sure of it. So, for example, you might collect a name. Now, depending on your organisation, in a bank, you need to know the full name of the person whose account you're opening, as well as a bunch of other stuff. But maybe you don't work at a bank, maybe you work somewhere else, and it's perfectly acceptable just to have the first initial of their last name. So JPH, and that's fine. Maybe you just need the first initial and the last initial of their name, so JH. And you can identify someone that way without providing the full amount of information. Same with the date of birth. Maybe you need to know how old someone is, but you don't really need to know their birthday. Just roughly might be great. So maybe you're doing market research and you want to interview people that are over 65 that live in Queensland. What you'd need is a year of birth. And if that's as specific as you need, then that's all you should collect. Same with the address. If you just need to know they live in Queensland, just collect the state they live. You don't need their full street address. So as you're building out these applications, and as part of your development processes and project initiations and things like that, think about how much of that information do we really need. If we need a little bit more, maybe we can collect it later. But right here, right now, let's collect the bare minimum. If you had a data breach and somebody said, we've leaked your first initial, the year you were born, and that you live in Queensland, you're not really going to be too concerned, right? But if it was your full name, address, date of birth, it starts building up a little bit more concerning. With things like police checks. So a lot of organisations will do police checks as part of their onboarding, and then regularly, every year or two after that. You don't necessarily need to collect all that information and have PDFs of the last 10 years worth of police checks on your file server somewhere. You might just need a checklist that says, yes, I've cited the police report, it's all good, and that's it. And you just have a record that you've seen the police report. You don't have the police report with all that information in. If there's an issue with it, it gets addressed at the time that you cite it. If not, you make a note and you move on. So, an example, in the local city council where I live, if I go into town and I want to park the car, I can use a smart meter. And that smart meter needs to know my space number, and I need to swipe my credit card to pay for it. You can't put coins in anymore because apparently that's old school. So two things. It doesn't identify me really. Not too concerned if that information got breached. Maybe they can steal some money off my credit card. Fingers crossed the bank will stop that. The smart meters are pretty slow and half the time don't work. So they have an app. Great. So on the app, for the same service, I need to provide my name, my email, my phone number, my registration, and the space number, and my payment card details that it saves. So there's a whole bunch more information that they're collecting about me that they can now lose because they're using, I don't know what, third-party app to provide service. That really all they need to know is the space number and my card number so they can charge me without all the other stuff. I'm not quite sure why they need all of that. There's data protection strategies, so we're talking about encrypting things, masking fields for certain access, again minimizing the data that you're collecting, and the general security things that we all know and love, like access control, MFA, firewalls, EDR, all that kind of fun stuff. I think I doubled up there. You also need to make sure that you're communicating clearly, so no hidden hard-to-find privacy policies like we had at the start, making sure that you're getting informed consent so people know what they're conforming about, and using that information for what it is collected. Making it easy to opt in and opt out. As part of your project initiation or your development process, or whenever you're starting something new or changing something significantly, you might like to do a privacy impact assessment. So as you're implementing your program, create a template to do this. Basically what it is it's looking at the change that you're going to make and the effects that that could have on the privacy of an individual. So if all of a sudden you're collecting a bunch more information, if that got breached, what would the impact be, that kind of thing. It means that you can evaluate the risks of doing that thing, implementing that new project, against the benefits of collecting that information to do the new thing as well. It also starts you thinking about, well, how can I mitigate these risks that I've identified through the assessment? What controls do we need to treat those, and is there anything else that we need to add, any new tools or processes to help along the way there as well? We have things called records of processing. So from all that data flow work you've done, you'll be able to come along and have a record of processing activity, which is something under GDPR that you'd need to have, not so much under the Australian privacy principles. But basically, you work out who you're transferring information to, some information about those parties, and whether they're a controller or a processor, why you're transferring the data to them, what they're going to do with it, and a history of those transfers as well, so you can go back and review those if you need to. So in the future, privacy is probably going to get a little bit more interesting. So right here and now, we need to be concerned about what we're collecting and why, and making sure we're using it for the purpose that we're collecting it for, and having that informed consent. So if anyone uses Slack, they've recently changed their policy so that they can now train their AI models on your chat history, which is fun. We need to make sure too, if we are using things, personal information in AI, and I'm sure you're all sick about hearing about AI this conference, there's been a fair bit of it, but if you're drawing conclusions from that data that relate to personal information, maybe you're trying to decide what party they're going to vote for based on what colour car they have or something. That opinion, if it's tied to that person, then becomes personal information as well. We've got to start thinking about biometrics, so face prints, fingerprints, voice prints, all that deep fake goodness and things like that. That becomes personal information. Things like DNA, like you can send away and get DNA tests now, something you didn't have to worry about 20 years ago or anything like that. In some cases, a DNA sample is considered PII. In some cases, it's not. It depends on the state that you're operating in. And what I think is super fun, probably not really, is the technology is progressing in such that things like your Apple Vision Pros will soon be reading your brainwaves. So there's research and proof of concepts out there. So when you're looking through, they can tell how you're feeling about things. If they flash up an ad, they'll be able to tell from your brainwave activity whether you like that ad or not, even if you don't click on it. So we're going to have to start thinking about how to protect that type of information within our privacy programs as well. So to sum up, we've worked out what regulations apply to us, where our PII is stored, what PII is collected, why is it collected, how it's being used. We've looked at our privacy risks, we've made sure that we're treating those privacy risks, and we're making sure that we've got those all integrated into our current policies and procedures. So that's really how you get started on your privacy framework, integrating it into your security framework, and moving forwards there. And just like to say thanks for coming and listening to my talk. And one thing that I've found myself saying a lot to some of our clients is, if you don't have it, they can't steal it. So make sure you're really minimising the data that you're collecting. Thanks.
Thanks, JP. That was a great take on what can be a very dry subject, but I think you've kept us engaged. You have run exactly to time, so there's no time for questions, but I will throw Cam's one at you because it's AI related. And it's basically with the march of technology, including security technologies like Palo's XSIAM, looking at our data, we don't really know where that data is going. How do we manage privacy around those? And a corollary to that is William's question around are machine-readable privacy policies through our API interconnects becoming viable now?
Yeah, so I think you still need to know where the information is going, even if it is going into a large language model or some other AI algorithm or something like that. And that's part of what the privacy principles are about, and what the regulations are about is understanding where that information is going and making sure as an organisation you're looking after that on behalf of the individual or the data subject or whatever you want to call them. So regardless of how it's being shared and sent and transacted, it needs to be known and mapped and looked after. In terms of machine-readable privacy policies, yeah, we'll see how that pans out, but it's probably something that is viable, and as AI gets smarter, maybe a bit more in use. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks again, JP.
No worries.
You could all join me in thanking JP again, please. Awesome. Thanks,
Cheers.